He married her to save her life. But neither of them knew that fate had already tied their souls together long before that moment. In a land ruled by fear, greed, and blood, two strangers were forced into a bond neither trusted. But sometimes love doesn't begin with affection. It begins with survival. And sometimes the person you think you saved is the one who ends up saving you. Stay with this story because what begins as a desperate deal slowly becomes something far more powerful than either of them expected.
Dawn had not yet broken, but the cold had already staked its claim on the valley. It was the dry, biting chill of the high desert in late autumn, the kind that carried no wind but slipped straight through wool and skin to settle deep in the marrow. Callum Hart stood at the eastern edge of Hart's Creek, a rusted shovel gripped in his numb hands. The fog hung low, thick and gray, clinging to the frozen earth like a shroud the morning sun was too weak to burn away. He wasn't fixing the fence. To anyone watching from the ridge, the 34-year-old rancher appeared to be setting a new post, but Callum's eyes were fixed on the earth at his boots. He drove the blade of the shovel into the soil, testing the resistance. It was hard, undisturbed. Good. He leaned against the wooden handle, his breath pluming in the freezing air. Beside him, an old cedar fence post jutted from the frost-hardened ground. Carved deeply into the weathered wood were the letters R.H., 1871. His brother's initials, Rowan's final arrogant marker. Callum reached into the breast pocket of his heavy canvas coat. His fingers brushed against the folded piece of paper resting over his heart. He didn't need to pull it out to know the words printed on the county letterhead. 90 days. That was the deadline Desmond Farrow had given him to clear the debt Rowan had left behind, or Hart's Creek would be auctioned off to the highest bidder. And Farrow, everyone knew, was always the highest bidder. But Farrow didn't just want the ranch. He wanted this specific corner of it, Quinn's Crossing. Callum looked down at the patch of dirt. He knew what was buried beneath it. He knew why Rowan had died a sudden violent death in the mines 2 years ago. And he knew why Farrow had been systematically suffocating Hart's Creek ever since. If Farrow ever dug up what Rowan had hidden here, the town of Duskwell would drown in blood and Callum would be the first to bleed. He tapped the earth one last time with the shovel, a silent vow to a dead brother, before turning his back on the boundary line. He had to go to town. He needed men to work the autumn drive, and he was running out of time, money, and options. The town of Duskwell was drowning in November mud. Callum tethered his horse outside May Sutton's saloon, pulling his hat low against the biting wind. He had spent the last 2 hours walking from the livery to the general store, offering wages to 3 different men. All 3 had politely but firmly declined. "Word is, Farrow's taking a hard look at that acreage of yours, Hart," one of them had muttered, refusing to meet Callum's eyes. "I got a family. I ain't getting caught between a hungry dog and a bone." Callum didn't argue. He couldn't afford to pay them a decent wage anyway. He had 1 small leather pouch of silver coins left to his name, barely enough to buy a month's worth of feed, let alone a hired gun or an honest ranch hand. He stepped out of the saloon, the taste of cheap whiskey bitter on his tongue, and headed toward the sheriff's office to check the public notices. But as he approached the weathered building, a raised voice bled through the thin glass of the window. "Farrow." Callum stopped. Desmond Farrow never raised his voice unless he was closing a trap. Callum pushed the heavy oak door open. The heat of the potbelly stove hit him first, followed by the suffocating tension in the room. Sheriff Miller was standing behind his desk, looking anywhere but at the center of the room. Desmond Farrow stood near the hearth. He was a man in his early 50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored wool suit that looked utterly out of place in the dusty frontier town. He looked like a banker. He operated like a butcher. But it was the person standing across from Farrow that made Callum's hand instinctively drift toward the heavy Colt revolver resting on his hip. It was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 18. Her dress was faded, the hem caked with mud, and her threadbare shawl offered no real protection against the cold. Yet she stood with her spine completely straight, her chin tipped upward. There was no fear in her eyes, only a cold, crystalline fury. "The debt was my father's, Mr. Farrow." Her voice was surprisingly steady, though Callum could see her raw, red hands trembling at her sides. "He is dead. The law says..." The law says, Farrow interrupted, his tone smooth, almost grandfatherly, that when Thomas Quinn passed, his obligations fell to his estate. You are his estate, Elara. And unless you have $400 hidden in that apron of yours, the judge has authorized me to collect what is owed. Farrow tapped a heavy piece of parchment resting on the sheriff's desk. Indentured servitude, Farrow said gently. 5 years working at my estate. Or, if you prefer a more comfortable arrangement, we could skip the contract and you could come live in the main house. I have always admired your spirit, Elara. The implication hung in the air, heavy and rancid. Sheriff Miller swallowed hard, suddenly very interested in his boots. Elara Quinn. Callum's blood ran cold. Quinn. The name struck him like a physical blow. The original owner of the land where Rowan's secret was buried. The land Farrow was so desperate to reclaim. Farrow wasn't just collecting a debt. He was tying up the last loose end. If he owned the Quinn girl, nobody could ever dispute the claim to Quinn's crossing. Elara stared at the contract. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She looked at Farrow with a hatred so pure it practically hummed in the quiet room. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the pen on the desk. She was going to sign it. She was going to sell her life to keep from being dragged into his bed. She ain't signing that. Callum's voice sounded like gravel grinding against iron. All three heads snapped toward the door. Callum stepped fully into the room, kicking the door shut behind him. He didn't look at the girl. His eyes were locked dead on Farrow. Hart, Farrow said, his pleasant smile faltering for a fraction of a second before returning. This doesn't concern you. You have your own debts to worry about. I'm making it my concern. Callum walked to the desk. He pulled the heavy leather pouch of silver from his coat and slammed it down onto the paperwork. How much is the debt? 400, Miller stammered. But Callum, there ain't more than $50 in that bag. It's a down payment, Callum said, his voice flat. He turned to the sheriff. Under the Homestead Act and the territorial debt laws, a woman's debt is legally absorbed by her husband upon marriage. Is that right, Miller? The room went deathly silent. Elara's breath hitched. She finally looked at Callum. Her eyes, wide and striking, searched his face, looking for the catch. What are you doing? She whispered, her voice tight. I'm paying your father's debt, Callum said to her, his expression unreadable. By making it mine. Farrow stepped forward, the grandfatherly facade melting away to reveal the cold, calculating predator beneath. You can't afford your own land, Hart. You think you can take on Quinn's debt? You marry her, I'll seize your ranch by the end of the month. I will ruin you. You were going to try anyway, Desmond, Callum shot back, stepping into Farrow's space. Callum was taller, broader, his shoulders built by years of breaking horses and breaking rock. The debt transfers to me. The girl walks. Process the paperwork, Miller. Miller, eager to be entirely done with the situation, scrambled for the marriage ledger. Farrow stared at Callum, his jaw tight. He looked from Callum to Elara, realizing the legal loophole had just snapped shut on his fingers. The land claim was now infinitely more complicated. You have no idea what you're buying, Hart, Farrow whispered softly. You just dug your own grave. I've been digging it for 2 years, Callum replied. Get out! Farrow adjusted his coat, offered a polite, terrifying nod to Elara, and walked out into the cold. Sheriff Miller cleared his throat. I need signatures. And a ring. Law says there has to be a token of exchange. Callum looked at the girl. Elara Quinn. 18 years old. A stranger. He had just shackled himself to her, and she to him, over a piece of blood-soaked land she probably knew nothing about. Callum reached into his pocket. He didn't have a ring. But his fingers brushed against a piece of hardware he had absent-mindedly picked up near the barn that morning. A heavy, rusted iron nut stripped from an old wagon wheel. He pulled it out and held it up. It was rough, heavy, and ugly. Elara looked at the rusted iron. Then she looked up into Callum's eyes. She didn't hesitate. She held out her left hand. Her fingers were freezing to the touch. Callum slid the iron nut onto her ring finger. It was too big, but she curled her hand into a fist to keep it from slipping off. Sign here, Miller said. They signed. The wagon ride back to Hart's Creek was suffocatingly silent. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long, bruised shadows across the desert scrub. Callum drove the team of horses, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He could feel the weight of his empty pockets. He had given Pharaoh every cent he had, taken on a massive debt, and painted a target on his own back. Elara sat beside him on the wooden bench. She hadn't spoken a word since they left the sheriff's office. She sat perfectly rigid, staring straight ahead, her hands folded in her lap. The rusted iron nut looked absurdly large on her slender finger. Callum shifted the reins. "I don't expect anything from you," he said gruffly, the wind tearing the words from his mouth. "You'll sleep in the spare room. You help around the house, you stay out of my way, and when I figure a way out of this mess with Pharaoh, I'll sign the annulment papers. You'll be free." Elara slowly turned her head to look at him. The fading light caught her features. Sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes that held far too many secrets for an 18-year-old. "You didn't do this out of the kindness of your heart, Mr. Hart," she said, her voice carrying clearly over the rattle of the wagon wheels. "A man doesn't buy a debt he can't pay, unless he's protecting something worth more than money." Callum's grip on the leather reins tightened until his knuckles went white. He kept his eyes on the road. "Just stay away from the east boundary," Callum warned, his voice dangerously low. "The land near the crossing. Don't go near it." Elara looked down at the heavy, rusted ring on her hand. She didn't agree. She didn't argue. She just wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and looked back out at the sprawling, barren land. Callum thought he had bought a helpless girl to keep Pharaoh away from his brother's secret. But as the silhouette of Hart's Creek appeared in the distance, a chilling realization settled in his gut. Elara Quinn hadn't bargained for her life. She hadn't negotiated. She had stepped into the trap perfectly, waiting for someone to spring it. And Callum was beginning to wonder who had really trapped whom. The silence of Hart's Creek was different from the silence of the open plains. Out on the plains, the quiet was vast and empty. Inside the walls of the weathered ranch house, the silence was thick, heavy, and breathing. Callum Hart woke at exactly 4:30 in the morning. It was a habit forged by 5 years of solitary, bone-breaking labor. The air in his bedroom was freezing, his breath curling into a white mist above him. He stared at the water stains on the timber ceiling for a long moment, feeling the familiar grinding ache in his right shoulder. Then the events of the previous day crashed over him like a wave of ice water. $400, a rusted iron nut, a wife. He sat up, swinging his legs over the edge of the cot. He dragged a hand down his face, the stubble rough against his palm. He had brought a stranger into his house, a girl who was practically still a child by the world's standards, but whose eyes held the hardened edge of a veteran. He had tied her fate to his, to keep Pharaoh away from the eastern ridge. It was a tactical move, desperate and reckless, but it was done. Callum dressed in the dark, pulling on stiff canvas trousers, a flannel shirt, and his heavy boots. He expected the house to be dead quiet. He expected to have to light the stove, fetch the water, and start the grueling day alone, just as he always did. But as he stepped out of his room and moved down the narrow hallway, a smell drifted up the stairs. Wood smoke and bitter boiling coffee. Callum paused on the top step, his hand resting on the smooth wood of the banister. He descended silently, stepping over the floorboard on the third step that he knew groaned. When he reached the kitchen doorway, he stopped. Elara was there. She had found one of his old, oversized wool coats hanging by the door and wrapped it around her thin dress. The sleeves were rolled up past her elbows, revealing pale, slender forearms. She was standing at the cast-iron stove, using a rag to lift a heavy blackened percolator off the direct heat. As she set the pot down on the iron trivet, a sharp clink echoed in the quiet room. Callum's eyes dropped to her left hand. The oversized, rusted iron nut he had shoved onto her finger yesterday was still there. She had wrapped a thin piece of twine around the base of it to keep it from slipping off her knuckle. The sight of it, ugly, jagged, and aggressively permanent, twisted something uncomfortable in Callum's chest. "You're up early," Callum said. His voice was a low rumble, startling her. Elara didn't jump, but her shoulders stiffened. She turned slowly. Her hair, a dark chestnut brown, was braided tightly down her back, though a few stray strands framed her sharp jawline. In the dim lantern light, she looked like a ghost haunting his kitchen. "I'm used to early mornings," she replied evenly. Her tone held no warmth, no morning pleasantries. It was a statement of fact. She reached for 2 tin mugs on the shelf, pouring the dark liquid into both. She pushed one across the scarred wooden table toward him. "I didn't know how much grounds you use, I guessed." Callum walked into the room feeling bizarrely like an intruder in his own home. He took the mug. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint off a barn. It was exactly how he liked it. "It's fine," he said, taking a sip. He didn't know what to do with her. The unspoken rules of his solitary life were already being dismantled. In Callum's world, everything had a specific order. The horses were fed before the fire was lit. The fences were walked before breakfast. He worked alone, ate alone, and expected nothing from anyone. He watched her take her mug and lean against the counter, keeping a careful distance from him. She wasn't acting like a grateful rescue. She wasn't acting like a frightened victim. She was acting like a hired hand assessing her new outpost. "I need to know the perimeter," Elara said, breaking the silence. She stared into her black coffee. "If I'm going to work this ranch, I need to know where the lines are drawn, what needs fixing." "You don't need to work," Callum said, his voice hardening slightly. "I told you yesterday, you stay out of the way, you maintain the house, that's it. You aren't a ranch hand." Elara's eyes flicked up to meet his. The firelight caught the amber in her irises. "Mr. Hart, let's not pretend this is a normal marriage, and let's not pretend you can afford to turn away free labor. Your South Corral gate is hanging by a single rusted hinge. 3 of your saddles in the barn need oiling or they'll crack by winter, and from the look of the woodpile out back, you're going to freeze to death before January." Callum gritted his teeth. She was right, and he hated it. "I'll handle the wood." "I'll handle the gate," she shot back smoothly. "Just show me the property lines." An hour later, the sun finally crested the horizon, bleeding pale gold light over the frost-covered scrubland. Callum rode his bay gelding, leading a gray mare that Elara rode with surprising ease. She sat straight in the saddle, her eyes sweeping over the barren, rugged terrain of Hart's Creek with an intensity that unnerved him. He showed her the northern pastures, the western creek bed that dried up in July, and the southern tree line. But as they circled back toward the eastern edge of the property, Callum pulled his horse to a halt at the top of a steep, rocky ridge. Below them, the land dipped into a small, shadowed valley. A dry riverbed carved through the center of it, flanked by dead cottonwood trees. The soil down there was different, darker, softer. "What's down there?" Elara asked, her horse stepping restlessly beside his. Callum's jaw tightened. He stared down into the valley, visualizing the exact patch of dirt where he had stood yesterday morning. The grave of his brother's secrets. "That's the eastern boundary," Callum said, his voice dropping an octave, losing any trace of the reluctant tolerance he had shown all morning. "They call it Quinn's Crossing." He saw Elara flinch. It was microscopic, a slight tightening of her hands on the reins. But he saw it. Of course she knew the name. It was her family's name, the land her father had lost. Callum turned in his saddle to face her fully. He needed her to understand this without telling her the lethal truth. "Listen to me carefully, Elara," he said, the command sharp and absolute. "You can ride the North Ridge. You can walk the creek. You can take the wagon into town if you need supplies. But you do not go down into that valley, ever, for any reason." Elara stared at him, her chin tilting up defensively. "Why? The grass is thicker down there. If the winter is hard, the cattle could—" "I don't care about the cattle," Callum snapped, his voice echoing off the rocks. His sudden anger silenced her. He took a deep breath, reining in the panic that always flared when he thought about the crossing. "The ground is unstable. There are old mine shafts covered by brush. It's a dead zone. You stay away from the East Ridge, do you understand me?" Elara looked down into the valley, then back at him. Her face was an unreadable mask. "I understand, Mr. Hart." She didn't say "I promise." That evening, the tension in the house was suffocating. They ate dinner in silence, a stew Elara had managed to make from the meager supplies in the pantry. When the plates were cleared, Callum didn't linger by the fire. He walked down the hall to his bedroom. He stepped inside, pushing the heavy wooden door shut. Click. The sound of the heavy iron bolt sliding into place echoed down the quiet hallway. Callum leaned his forehead against the rough wood of the door, closing his eyes. On the other side of the house, in the small guest room, Elara heard the lock engage. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, looking down at her left hand. She traced the cold, rusted iron nut with her thumb. He was locking her out. Or maybe he was locking himself in. She turned her head toward the small window, looking out into the pitch-black night. Her eyes settled on the dark silhouette of the eastern ridge, Quinn's Crossing. Unstable ground. Old mine shafts. A lie. She knew it was a lie. Her father had walked every inch of that land before it was stolen. There were no mines at the crossing. Whatever Callum Hart was hiding, whatever he had bought her to protect, it was buried down there in the dark. And Elara intended to find out exactly what it was. 4 days into their paper marriage, the ghost of Desmond Farrow finally materialized at Hart's Creek. Callum was in the barn, hammering a hot iron shoe onto the hoof of a restless roan when he heard the rhythmic, expensive crunch of carriage wheels on gravel. He didn't need to look outside to know who it was. The horses of the hired men around Duskwell didn't step in that synchronized, aristocratic cadence. Callum dropped the hammer. It hit the dirt with a heavy thud. He wiped his blackened hands on a rag, pulled his Colt revolver from its holster hanging on the stall door, checked the cylinder, and slid it into his waistband. He stepped out of the dim barn and into the blinding midday sun. A sleek black buggy was parked near the front porch. The horse pulling it was a purebred black stallion, its coat shining like polished obsidian. Desmond Farrow sat on the leather bench seat, holding the reins with relaxed, gloved hands. He wore a charcoal gray suit, a pristine white shirt, and a bowler hat that kept the harsh sun off his meticulously shaved face. But Farrow wasn't looking at Callum, he was looking at the porch. Callum's blood pressure spiked. Elara was standing on the top step of the porch, holding a bucket of soapy water and a scrub brush. She had frozen mid-motion, her eyes locked on Farrow like a rabbit caught in the gaze of a coyote. "A lovely morning, Mrs. Hart," Farrow said, his voice a smooth, venomous purr. He tipped his hat. "I must say, frontier life seems to agree with you. Though it is a tragedy to see hands meant for playing the piano forced to scrub dirty floorboards." Elara didn't flinch. She gripped the handle of the bucket until her knuckles turned white. "My father didn't own a piano, Mr. Farrow. My hands are exactly where they belong." Farrow chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Loyal to the grave. Thomas Quinn would be proud. Or perhaps he would be weeping, knowing his only daughter sold herself to a failing dirt farmer just to spite me. Get off my land, Desmond." Callum's voice cut across the yard like a bullwhip. He walked toward the buggy, his boots kicking up dust, his hand resting casually near his waist. Farrow turned his attention to Callum, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Callum, I was just congratulating your new bride. A sudden wedding. Very romantic. Though some in town might call it an act of sheer suicidal panic." "I'm not interested in town gossip," Callum said, stopping a few feet from the buggy. He positioned his body between Farrow and the porch, blocking Farrow's view of Elara. "You have no business here. The debt is absorbed. The payments will be made on the 1st of the month at the bank, as required by law. You don't step foot on Hart's Creek again." Farrow sighed, adjusting his leather gloves. "You always were a remarkably short-sighted man, Callum, just like Rowan. You see a piece of paper and think the game is over." Farrow leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. The grandfatherly facade completely vanished, leaving only the ruthless, dead-eyed businessman who had bled the county dry for a decade. "I didn't come here for the monthly payment, boy," Farrow said softly, his voice barely carrying over the wind. "I came to check on my investments. You've bought yourself some time with this little marriage stunt, yes. The law protects a homestead. But accidents happen on the frontier, Callum. Terrible, tragic accidents." Callum's muscles coiled tight. "Is that a threat?" It's an observation, Pharaoh replied, his eyes drifting past Callum toward the eastern horizon, toward Quinn's Crossing. The soil is very loose on the east side of your property. Heavy rains are coming, landslides, sinkholes. A man could go riding out there and simply disappear. Or worse, a fire could start in the dead of night. Dry timber burns so fast. It would be a shame if your beautiful new bride were to be caught in the blaze while you were out patrolling your fences. A cold, murderous rage flared in Callum's chest. He took a step closer to the buggy. You send men onto my land, Pharaoh, and I won't bother with the sheriff. I'll bury them where they fall. You already have enough buried on this land, don't you, Hart? Pharaoh whispered, his eyes flashing with a dangerous, knowing light. Callum's heart slammed against his ribs. He knows. Pharaoh might not know exactly where it was, but he knew Rowan had hidden it here. Pharaoh sat back, picking up the reins. I am a patient man, Callum, but I do not lose. You have something that belongs to me. You are sitting on it, and if you do not surrender it willingly, I will tear this entire ranch apart, board by board, bone by bone, until I find it. He looked past Callum one last time. Have a wonderful honeymoon, Mrs. Hart. Sleep lightly. Pharaoh snapped the reins, and the black buggy turned smoothly, rolling back down the long dirt driveway, leaving a cloud of choking dust in its wake. Callum stood in the yard for a long time, watching the buggy shrink into a black speck on the horizon. His breathing was heavy, the adrenaline making his hands shake slightly. He heard the soft creak of the porch boards behind him. Elara walked down the steps. She didn't ask what Pharaoh meant. She didn't ask about the threats of fire and buried things. She walked right past Callum, picked up the dropped hammer from the dirt, and held it out to him. You have a horse to shoe, she said quietly. Callum looked at her. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She knew Pharaoh had just declared war, and she wasn't running. He took the hammer. Go inside, Elara. Keep the doors locked. Midnight. The temperature had dropped to freezing, and a biting wind howled through the canyons, rattling the windows of the ranch house. Callum sat on a cold, flat boulder near the crest of the eastern ridge. His heavy wool coat was pulled tight around his neck, and his hat was pulled low. Across his lap lay his Winchester 1873 rifle, the brass receiver gleaming dully in the pale moonlight. Below him lay Quinn's Crossing. The valley was draped in impenetrable shadows. The wind moved through the dead cottonwood trees, making them sound like rattling bones. Callum sat perfectly still, his eyes scanning the tree line, his ears straining for the sound of snapping twigs or horse hooves. Pharaoh's visit had shattered whatever fragile peace Callum had managed to construct. You already have enough buried on this land. Rowan's ghost felt very close tonight. Callum remembered the night his brother died, the cave-in at the silver mine, the crushed ribs, the blood on Rowan's lips as he pulled Callum close in the infirmary, shoving a bloody folded map into his hand. Don't let him take the crossing, Cal. God forgive me, I took it. The gold, the ledger, it's in the dirt. Pharaoh will kill everyone to get it back. Keep the land, keep them away. Rowan had robbed Desmond Pharaoh. He had stolen the illicit gold Pharaoh had skimmed from the government railways, along with the ledger that proved Pharaoh was behind half the murders in the territory. Rowan had hidden it at Quinn's Crossing, intending to use it to destroy Pharaoh, but the mine had claimed Rowan before he could finish the job. Now, Callum was the warden of a graveyard. He racked the lever of the Winchester, the mechanical clack-clack sounding obscenely loud in the quiet night. A brass cartridge slid smoothly into the chamber. He had married the Quinn girl to legally fortify the land claim, preventing Pharaoh from simply seizing the property through the county courts. But Pharaoh had just made it clear that he was done playing with the courts. The legal battle was over. The blood war was about to begin. Callum looked back over his shoulder toward the ranch house in the distance. A single faint yellow light burned in the window of the guest room. Elara was awake. He had dragged an 18-year-old girl into the center of a kill zone. If Pharaoh's men came in the dark, they wouldn't ask to see a marriage certificate. They would burn the house with her inside it. Callum turned back to the dark valley, his finger resting lightly on the trigger guard of the rifle. The cold seeped into his bones, but he didn't move. He would sit here until dawn. He would sit here every night if he had to. He had promised to keep the land. He hadn't promised he would survive it. The moon was a sharp silver crescent, bleeding weak light over the jagged spine of the eastern ridge. It was past 2 in the morning. The wind had died down, leaving a stillness so profound that Callum could hear the blood rushing in his own ears. He'd been holding his position on the rocks above Quinn's Crossing for hours, the freezing air settling deep into his joints. The cold was a physical weight, but the Winchester rifle in his lap kept him anchored. Then he heard it. Thud. Scrape. It was faint, muffled by the distance and the dry earth, but to a man who had spent half his life in the mines, the sound was unmistakable. It was the rhythmic bite of a shovel driving into packed dirt. Callum's blood turned to ice. Pharaoh's men hadn't waited. They were already here. He didn't stand up. Standing would cast a silhouette against the starlit sky. Instead, he slid backward off the boulder, his boots making no sound on the frost-hardened ground. He moved down the treacherous incline toward the valley floor, slipping through the shadows of the dead cottonwoods like a hunting wolf. He left the rifle slung across his back. In the dense, dark brush of the creek bed, the long barrel was a liability. He drew the Colt revolver from his hip, his thumb resting heavily on the hammer. Thud. Scrape. The sound grew louder. Callum crept closer, using the trunk of a massive rotted cedar for cover. Through the tangled branches, he saw a dark shape moving near the dried riverbank, the exact spot where Callum had stood yesterday morning. The figure was small, draped in a heavy, oversized coat, digging with a frantic, desperate energy. Callum didn't hesitate. He didn't call out a warning. If this was one of Pharaoh's killers, a warning was a death sentence. He lunged from the shadows. He closed the distance in 3 massive strides, grabbing the figure by the collar of the heavy coat and shoving them violently face first into the dirt. The shovel clattered against a rock. Callum drove his knee into the intruder's back, pinning them to the frozen earth, and pressed the cold steel barrel of the Colt directly against the back of their skull. "Don't move a muscle," Callum hissed, his voice a low, lethal rasp. "Give me one reason not to blow your brains into the dirt." The figure beneath him went entirely rigid. But there was no curse, no plea for mercy, only a sharp, ragged gasp of air. And then the scent hit him. Lye soap, wood smoke, and a faint, impossible trace of lavender. Callum's heart seized. He ripped the heavy wool hood back. A cascade of dark chestnut hair spilled into the dirt. Ilara turned her head, her cheek pressed against the freezing frost, her eyes wide and glowing with a feral, terrified light in the darkness. Callum recoiled as if the ground had caught fire. He holstered his gun instantly, his chest heaving as the adrenaline crashed through his system, leaving him dizzy and sick. "Ilara?" he choked out, stepping back, his hands shaking. "Christ almighty, Ilara, I almost blew your head off." She didn't stay down. She scrambled to her feet, her hands scraped and bleeding from the frozen dirt. She didn't brush off her dress. She immediately lunged for the dropped shovel. Callum was faster. He kicked the wooden handle out of her reach, grabbing her by the arms and spinning her to face him. "What in the name of God are you doing down here?" he roared, the silence of the valley shattering around them. "I told you never to come to the crossing." Ilara wrenched her arms out of his grip, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She wasn't crying. There were no tears in her eyes, only a furious, burning defiance that rivaled the cold. "I don't take orders from you, Callum," she spat, her voice vibrating with rage. "This is my father's land." "It's a graveyard," Callum shouted back, pointing at the half-dug hole. "If Pharaoh's men had caught you out here instead of me, you'd be bleeding out in the dirt right now. Do you have any idea what you're looking for?" "I know exactly what I'm looking for," Ilara screamed, stepping into his space, her small frame radiating an unimaginable intensity. "I'm looking for the blood money your bastard of a brother buried under my family's soil." The wind seemed to stop entirely. The words hung in the freezing air between them, sharp and deadly as broken glass. Callum stared at her, the pieces of the puzzle suddenly shifting, realigning themselves into a horrifying new picture. She knew. She didn't just know about the land dispute. She knew about the gold. She knew about the ledger. How? Callum whispered, his voice dangerously quiet. Ilara's jaw trembled, but she held his gaze. My father didn't just lose this land to a crooked judge, Callum. He lost it because he saw Desmond Farrow's men moving unmarked strongboxes off the Union Pacific rail line in the dead of night. He saw your brother Rowan riding with them. My father was going to the territorial marshal. That's why the judge took the land. That's why my father died of a sudden fever a month later. Callum felt the breath knocked out of him. Rowan. His brother had been running with Farrow before he betrayed him. When Rowan died, Ilara continued, her voice turning razor-sharp, I knew he had double-crossed Farrow. I knew Farrow never found the boxes. And I knew Rowan would only hide them in one place, the one place he stole just to keep people away from. Callum took a slow step back, looking at the 18-year-old girl standing in the moonlight. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't a desperate orphan clinging to a sudden savior. His mind flashed back to the sheriff's office. The perfectly timed confrontation. The way she had pushed Farrow loud enough for her voice to bleed through the window just as Callum walked by. The way she had immediately accepted the iron nut on her finger. You didn't stumble into Farrow at the sheriff's office, Callum said, his voice hollow, the realization settling like lead in his stomach. You knew I was in town. You knew I was desperate for hands. You baited him in public. Ilara lifted her chin. She didn't deny it. You knew, Callum continued, the anger slowly replacing the shock, that I couldn't afford to let Farrow take possession of you because if he owned you, he legally owned the crossing. You forced my hand. You used me to buy your way back onto this ranch. I survived, Callum, Ilara fired back, refusing to back down. Farrow would have killed me eventually. You needed a wife to anchor the deed to Hart's Creek. I needed a husband who was already digging his own grave to get me past Farrow's guards. It was a transaction. You bought my debt. I gave you my name. Callum let out a bitter, humorless laugh. He ran a hand through his hair, staring at the dark earth. He had thought he was a martyr, sacrificing his own freedom to save an innocent girl from a predator. But he hadn't rescued a lamb. He had married a wolf. You're a fool, Ilara, he said softly, looking back at her. You think finding that gold will save you? It's a death warrant. If you dig it up, Farrow won't just kill you. He'll peel the skin from your bones to get it back. I'm going to use it to destroy him, she vowed, stepping toward the shovel again. No, you aren't. Callum stepped on the blade of the shovel, his weight immovable. He looked at his wife, his eyes completely dead. Because you aren't going to touch it. Go back to the house. It belongs to my family. Your family is dead because of it, Callum roared. Go back to the house, Ilara, before I throw you over my shoulder and carry you there myself. This conversation is over. For a long moment, she looked like she was going to strike him. Her fists were clenched, her breath pluming in the air. But she saw the absolute, immovable resolve in his eyes. She turned sharply, her heavy coat swishing, and began the long, dark climb back up the ridge, leaving Callum alone with the dirt, the shovel, and the crushing weight of the secrets he was dying to keep. Ilara didn't wait for him in the house. She waited in the barn. When Callum finally returned, his boots heavy with frozen mud, he found her standing in the center aisle, illuminated by the harsh, flickering yellow light of a single kerosene lantern hanging from a crossbeam. The horses shifted nervously in their stalls, sensing the electric, violent tension radiating from the two humans. Callum walked in carrying the shovel. He didn't say a word. He walked to the tool rack and slammed the shovel onto the iron hooks with a deafening clang that made the horses jump. You're just like them, Ilara said to his back. Her voice wasn't yelling anymore. It was worse. It was laced with absolute acidic disgust. Callum froze, his hands still gripping the rack. He slowly turned around. You pretend to be the honorable rancher, she continued, stepping closer to the lantern, the shadows dancing violently across her face. You play the silent, long-suffering cowboy, fixing fences and working yourself to the bone. But you're just like Rowan. You're just like Farrow. You're sitting on a fortune in stolen gold, letting yourself starve, letting me freeze in that house because you're too greedy to share it and too cowardly to spend it. The fragile glass holding Callum's legendary restraint finally shattered. He crossed the barn aisle in 2 seconds. He didn't touch her, but he crowded her against the rough wood of a stall door, towering over her, his chest heaving. The sheer physical intimidation of a man pushed to his absolute breaking point radiated from him in waves. "Greedy?" Callum snarled, his voice a guttural scrape that barely sounded human. "You think this is about money?" Elara pressed her back against the wood, her eyes wide, but she jutted her chin out. "Then dig it up! Give it to the Pinkertons, give it to the Marshals! If you aren't a thief, then end this!" Callum let out a sound that was half laugh, half growl. He slammed his palm against the stall door right beside her head. "There are no Marshals, Elara," he roared, the sound echoing off the high rafters. "Who do you think Pharaoh was stealing the gold for? Himself? You think one man runs the entire county without a leash? That ledger buried in the dirt out there doesn't just have Pharaoh's name on it. It has the names of the territorial judges. It has the names of the Union Pacific executives. It has the names of the men who write the laws in this God-forsaken territory." Elara blinked, the color draining slightly from her face. "No, the law works for the men who can afford to buy it." Callum cut her off, his voice cracking with exhaustion and rage. "Rowan didn't just steal gold. He stole the chain that connects Pharaoh to the governor's office. Rowan dug up hell, realized the devil was too big to kill, and handed me the shovel before he died." He stepped back, running both hands over his face, pressing his palms into his eyes until he saw stars. His shoulders, usually so broad and straight, suddenly slumped as if the gravity in the barn had doubled. "If I dig that box up," Callum said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "and try to hand it to a marshal, I won't make it to the county line. They will slaughter me, but they won't stop there. They'll slaughter you because you're my wife. They'll burn May Sutton in her saloon because she poured me a drink last week. They will wipe Hart's Creek off the map to leave no witnesses." Elara stared at him, her chest rising and falling as the horrifying reality of the situation crashed over her. She had thought she was playing a game of chess against a local tyrant. She hadn't realized the board was rigged with dynamite. "You don't understand Pharaoh," Callum continued, looking at her with eyes that were ancient and hollow. "He isn't threatening us to get his money back. He's waiting to see if I know where it is. As long as the gold stays buried, and as long as I play the dumb, broke rancher who doesn't know anything about his brother's sins." He hesitates. "The uncertainty is the only thing keeping us alive. The second I put a shovel in that ground and pull that box up, the timer runs out." Silence descended on the barn, thick and suffocating. The wind howled outside, throwing sleet against the wooden siding. Elara looked at Callum's hands. They were scarred, blistered, the knuckles split from cold and labor. She looked at his worn-out coat, his exhausted posture. He wasn't a dragon hoarding gold. He was a man sitting on a bomb, using his own body as a blast shield to protect a town that didn't even like him. "And the lock?" Elara whispered, her voice trembling for the first time. "Every night, you lock your bedroom door." Callum looked away, his jaw tightening. "I didn't lock my door to keep you out, Elara," he said softly. "I lock it so that when Pharaoh's men finally come in the dark to cut my throat, you can swear to God you were locked away from me. You can tell them you were a prisoner, a forced bride who knew nothing. It's your only alibi." Elara felt the breath leave her lungs. She looked down at her left hand, at the ugly, rusted iron nut wrapped in twine. She had manipulated this man. She had used his honor against him to force a marriage, thinking she was the clever survivor outsmarting a fool. But Callum hadn't been tricked. He had seen the trap, known it was a trap, and stepped into it anyway to put himself between her and Desmond Pharaoh. "You're a dead man, Callum Hart," she whispered, a sudden terrifying ache blooming in her chest. Callum gave a slow, tired nod. He reached over and picked up the lantern from the barrel. "I know, but I'll be damned if I let you die with me. Tomorrow, I'm taking you to the train station. I'll give you whatever silver I have left. You go to San Francisco. You disappear." He turned and started walking toward the barn doors, the lantern casting a long, lonely shadow ahead of him. "I'm not leaving." Callum stopped. He didn't turn around. "Don't be stupid, Elara. The game is over." "I said I'm not leaving." Elara's voice was no longer furious. It was steel. She walked down the aisle, stopping a few feet behind him. My father died for this land. I sold myself to stay on it. I am not running away so you can play the martyr." Callum slowly turned to face her. "If you stay, you die." "Then I'll die on my own dirt," she said, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made the breath catch in his throat. "We don't run. We don't dig it up. We fight. We fortify this ranch. And when Pharaoh comes, we make him bleed for every inch of it." Callum stared at the 18-year-old girl in the oversized coat. For the first time since he had returned to Hart's Creek, he didn't feel entirely alone in the dark. He looked down at her left hand. "You're crazy." "I'm your wife," she corrected him smoothly. "And you need someone to watch your back." Callum didn't argue. He couldn't. For the first time, he saw past the girl who had manipulated him, and saw the partner he desperately needed. The silence between them shifted. It was no longer the silence of secrets, but the silence of soldiers in the same trench. "Come on," Callum said softly, opening the barn door to the freezing wind. "Let's go home." The morning after the confrontation in the barn, the heavy iron bolt on Callum's bedroom door remained unthrown. Elara noticed it immediately when she walked down the hall carrying a stack of folded linens. The door was slightly ajar. It was a silent concession, a white flag raised over the no-man's land that had previously divided the house. The transaction was over. The partnership had begun. She found Callum in the kitchen, sitting at the scarred table. It was barely dawn, but he wasn't drinking coffee. The table was covered in an oiled canvas cloth. Laid out upon it were a disassembled Winchester rifle, 2 Colt revolvers, a double-barreled shotgun, and several boxes of heavy brass ammunition. The air smelled sharply of sulfur, gun oil, and cold iron. Callum looked up as she entered. His eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, but the hollow, defeated look from the night before was gone. In its place was the grim, focused intensity of a man preparing for war. "Do you know how to use a long gun?" he asked, his voice rough. He didn't offer a morning greeting. There was no time for it. Elara set the linens down and walked to the table. She picked up the heavy receiver of the Winchester, her thumb instinctively checking the loading gate. "My father taught me to shoot coyotes when I was 12. I can handle the recoil, but I'm faster with a scattergun in close quarters." Callum watched her hands. They were steady. He nodded slowly, picking up a rag and a tin of oil. "Pharaoh's men won't come in the daylight. They're cowards who thrive in the dark. If they breach the perimeter, they'll try to smoke us out first. We need to board the ground floor windows, leave only firing slats. We'll secure the horses in the stone corral behind the house. It's harder to burn than the wooden barn." For the next 3 days, Hart's Creek transformed from a failing cattle ranch into a fortress. They worked side by side, a synchronized machine driven by pure survival instinct. The awkwardness of their paper marriage dissolved into the sweat and grime of physical labor. They dragged heavy oak beams across the doors, nailed thick planks over the glass, and hauled buckets of water from the creek to position around the house in case of fire. The silence between them changed. It was no longer a weapon used to keep each other at a distance. It was the comfortable, necessary quiet of 2 people who trusted the person watching their back. On the afternoon of the 4th day, the sky bruised purple, heavy with the promise of a brutal winter storm. Callum was on the roof, reinforcing the cedar shingles, while Elara was in the yard chopping kindling. Suddenly, Callum dropped his hammer. The sound of it sliding down the roof and hitting the dirt below made Elara spin around. Callum was staring down the long dirt driveway leading to the main road. He didn't shout, but his voice was tight and sharp. "Get in the house, now!" Elara didn't question him. She dropped the axe, scooped up the shotgun resting against the chopping block, and ran for the porch. Callum swung down from the roof, landing heavily in the dirt, his hand already drawing his Colt. A lone horse was walking up the driveway. It wasn't pulling a buggy. It wasn't moving with purpose. The animal's head hung low, its gait a sluggish, exhausted stumble. As it drew closer, the horrifying details snapped into focus. A man was slumped over the saddle, his hands bound tightly to the saddle horn with coarse, blood-soaked rope. Callum recognized the horse first, then the man. It was Silas, one of the ranch hands from the Duskwell saloon who had refused Callum's offer of work the week before. Callum sprinted forward, grabbing the horse's bridle to steady the panicked animal. "Silas!" He cut the ropes with his hunting knife and caught the man as he slid sideways out of the saddle. Silas's face was an unrecognizable mask of swelling and dried blood. His clothes were torn, and his breathing was a wet, rattling gasp. Elara ran down the steps with a canteen of water, her face pale but her hands remarkably steady. She knelt in the dirt beside them, pressing the canteen to Silas's cracked lips. Silas coughed, spitting a mixture of water and blood onto the frozen ground. His eyes fluttered open, rolling wildly until they locked onto Callum. Panic seized the broken man. He grabbed Callum's coat with trembling, bruised fingers. I didn't know anything, Hart," Silas gasped, his voice a broken wheeze. "I swear to God, Pharaoh's men, they dragged me out of the saloon, took me to the old slaughterhouse." Callum's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Pharaoh had realized Callum was patrolling the crossing. And Pharaoh, ever the predator, had assumed Callum had hired men to help him guard it. He had tortured an innocent man just for having a drink in the same room as Callum. "Who did this?" Callum demanded, gently supporting Silas's head. "Was it Pharaoh himself?" "His foreman! The one with the scar," Silas choked out, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. "He kept asking where the dirt was fresh. I told him I didn't work for you. I told him I didn't know." Silas's grip on Callum's coat tightened convulsively. "He told me to give you a message, Hart," Silas whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "He said, Pharaoh knows you haven't moved the boxes. He knows they're still in the dirt. He said you have 3 days to sign the deed over to him and walk away." Callum stared at the blood soaking into the dust of his driveway. "And if I don't?" Silas swallowed hard, a fresh line of blood dripping from his chin. "He said, on the 3rd night he's bringing 20 men. He said he's going to burn Hart's Creek to the foundation and nail you and your bride to the barn doors." A heavy, deathly silence fell over the yard, broken only by the low rumble of thunder echoing off the eastern ridge. Callum stood up slowly. He looked at Elara. She was still kneeling beside Silas, her hands stained with the man's blood. The terror Pharaoh had intended to strike into her heart wasn't there. Instead, her eyes were burning with a cold, absolute fury. 3 days. The ticking time bomb had finally reached 0. Pharaoh wasn't waiting for the legal battles anymore. He was coming to slaughter them all. Callum looked at the bruised sky. "Help me get him inside," he said to Elara. When Silas was bandaged and asleep in the spare room, Callum walked out to the porch. The wind was picking up, carrying the bitter scent of freezing rain. Elara followed him out, pulling a shawl tightly over her shoulders. 20 men, Elara said quietly into the wind. "We have enough ammunition to take down maybe 10 if they funnel through the front door." "They won't funnel," Callum replied, his eyes fixed on the distant shadowy valley of Quinn's Crossing. "They'll surround us, set fires, shoot us as we run out of the smoke." He leaned heavily against the wooden railing. The weight of his choices was finally crushing him. He had thought he could protect her by hiding the truth, but the truth had dug its own way out. "We can't fight 20 men with a box of secrets buried in the dirt, Elara," Callum said, his voice carrying a sudden, dangerous resolve. Elara turned to look at him, her breath catching in the freezing air. "You said digging it up was suicide." "Leaving it there is suicide," Callum corrected him, turning to face her. "If they breach the house, we have nothing to bargain with, nothing to use against him. If we're going to die over what my brother buried, I want to see exactly what the hell it is we're dying for." Lightning flashed across the dark clouds, illuminating the hard, sharp angles of Callum's face. "Get the wagon," Callum said, "and the shovels." The storm broke with a violent vengeance, just as the wagon reached the lip of the eastern ridge. It wasn't snow, but a torrential downpour of freezing rain that felt like shattered glass against their skin. The ground, previously hardened by frost, quickly turned into a slick, treacherous slide of dark mud. Callum didn't bring the horses all the way down into the valley. He tethered them to a thick stand of cedars near the crest, leaving Elara holding the reins of the nervous animals, while he pulled 2 heavy iron shovels and a coil of thick rope from the wagon bed. "Keep your head down," Callum shouted over the roar of the wind and rain. He handed her a shovel. If you hear riders, you leave the horses and run into the brush. Do not wait for me. Understand? Elara didn't argue. She gripped the handle of the shovel, the wood slick with rain, and nodded. They slid down the muddy embankment into Quinn's Crossing. The creek, usually a dry scar in the earth, was already churning with muddy runoff. The darkness was absolute save for the violent flashes of lightning that turned the dead cottonwoods into jagged skeletal sentinels. Callum led her to the exact spot where they had fought nights before. The earth here was slightly sunken, a telltale sign of disturbed dirt settling over time. "Here!" Callum roared over the storm. "Dig!" The labor was agonizing. The mud was thick and heavy, sucking at their boots and fighting the blades of their shovels. Within minutes, they were soaked to the bone, their muscles screaming in protest. Callum dug with a frantic, punishing rhythm, driven by the ticking clock of Pharaoh's ultimatum. Beside him, Elara matched his pace, her small frame throwing every ounce of leverage she had into the earth. An hour passed. The hole was waist-deep, filling with rainwater as fast as they could clear the mud. Callum's shovel struck something hard. It wasn't a rock. It was a hollow metallic clang that vibrated up the wooden handle and jarred Callum's teeth. He dropped the shovel and fell to his knees in the icy, muddy water. He clawed at the muck with his bare hands. Elara dropped to her knees beside him, her fingers digging frantically into the earth. Together, they unearthed the edges of a heavy iron strongbox. It was a Union Pacific Railway lockbox, designed to transport payroll. It was sealed with a massive brass padlock, but the metal was heavily corroded by 2 years in the damp earth. "Get the rope!" Callum yelled. They looped the thick hemp rope through the heavy iron handles on the side of the box. Standing on the lip of the hole, muscles burning, they hauled the lockbox out of its grave. It hit the muddy bank with a heavy, sickening thud. They didn't try to open it there. The rain was too heavy. It would ruin whatever paper was inside. Working with panicked speed, they dragged the iron box up the slippery embankment, hauled it into the back of the wagon, and threw a heavy canvas tarp over it. The ride back to the house was a blur of adrenaline and freezing rain. When they finally dragged the box into the center of the kitchen, they were both shivering uncontrollably, covered head to toe in black mud. Puddles of water pooled on the floorboards around them. Callum locked the front door, threw the deadbolt, and pulled the curtains shut over the barricaded windows. He turned to the box. He grabbed the heavy iron hammer he had used to board the windows. He raised it high above his head and brought it crashing down on the rusted brass padlock. Crack! The lock held. Callum gritted his teeth, his shoulders screaming in pain, and swung again. Crack! The brass casing shattered, the rusted internal mechanism breaking apart. Callum tossed the hammer aside. He knelt in front of the box. Elara knelt beside him, her breathing shallow, her eyes fixed on the heavy iron lid. This was it. The ghost that had haunted her family, the secret that had killed his brother. Callum gripped the latch and threw the lid back. The hinges screamed. Inside, wrapped in layers of thick, oiled canvas, was the treasure Desmond Pharaoh was willing to burn a town to retrieve. Callum peeled back the canvas. First were the gold certificates, stacks of them wrapped in twine bearing the seal of the United States Treasury. It was a staggering amount of money, enough to buy the entire county twice over. Beneath the certificates lay a heavy, leather-bound ledger. Callum carefully lifted it out. The pages were perfectly dry. He opened it, scanning the neat, meticulous handwriting. It was exactly what Rowan had promised. A master list of bribes, payoffs, and land thefts detailing exactly which judges and politicians Pharaoh owned. But it was what lay beneath the ledger that made Callum freeze. It was a small, flat, oilskin pouch tied with a leather cord. Pinned to the front of the pouch was an envelope yellowed with age. On the front of the envelope, written in a hurried, familiar scrawl, were the words, "To my brother Callum, when you finally stop running." Callum's hands began to shake. He slowly reached out and picked up the envelope. He broke the wax seal, sliding out a single sheet of paper. Elara watched him, her heart pounding against her ribs. "What is it?" she whispered. Callum read the letter in silence. As his eyes tracked down the page, all the color drained from his face. He lowered the paper, staring blankly at the far wall. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt too thin to breathe. "Callum?" Elara asked, panic edging into her voice. She reached out, touching his arm. What does it say? Callum slowly turned his head to look at her. The expression in his eyes was one of utter devastation and profound, staggering realization. He knew, Callum whispered, his voice cracking. Rowan knew he was going to die. Callum handed her the letter. Elara took it with trembling, mud-stained fingers, bringing it closer to the lantern light. The handwriting was jagged, written by a man who knew his time was up. Callum, if you're reading this, Pharaoh finally caught me, or the earth finally caved in. I took the devil's money, Cal. I thought I could use it to buy us out of this hellhole, but I only dug us deeper. The ledger is here, the gold is here, but they are poison. Do not try to spend it. Do not try to fight Pharaoh alone. But there is one thing I stole that wasn't poison. It's in the pouch. Pharaoh paid Judge Higgins to forge the claim against Thomas Quinn. I was the one who broke into the county office and stole the original deed to Quinn's Crossing to hide the evidence. Pharaoh thinks I burned it. I didn't. It's the only honest piece of paper in this whole godforsaken territory. I tracked the Quinn family. Thomas is dead, but he has a daughter. Elara. She was last seen working near Duskwell. Callum, I am leaving Heart's Creek to you because you are the only good man I know. But the land won't hold you unless you make it right. Find the girl. Do whatever it takes to protect her from Pharaoh. Marry her if you have to, under the Homestead Act, to legally anchor the deed back to her name so Pharaoh can't steal it again. Give her back the land, brother. Wash the blood off our name. Rowan. Elara stopped breathing. She stared at the words, reading them a second time, a third time. She slowly lowered the paper and looked at the oilskin pouch still resting inside the iron box. Callum reached in and opened it. He pulled out a heavy embossed document. The original undisputed deed to Quinn's Crossing. Elara covered her mouth with her hand, a sob finally breaking through the iron walls of her chest. She looked at Callum. He was staring at her hand, at the ugly rusted iron nut wrapped in twine on her finger. It hadn't been an accident. It hadn't just been a desperate legal loophole exploited in a moment of panic in the sheriff's office. When Callum threw his last bag of silver on the table to buy Elara's debt, he hadn't just been saving a stranger. He had been fulfilling his dead brother's dying wish, completely blind to the truth. Destiny, buried in the dirt, had reached up and pulled them together. He wanted us to find this, Elara whispered, tears finally spilling over her lashes, tracking through the mud on her face. He brought you back just to save me. Callum slowly reached out, his large, calloused hands gently gripping her trembling shoulders. Rowan didn't bring me back to save you, Elara, Callum said, his voice thick with emotion, staring into the eyes of the woman he had accidentally promised his life to. He brought me back so you could save me. The storm raged outside, throwing thunder against the barricaded walls. But inside the house, the war between Callum and Elara was finally over. Now there was only the war against the monster coming to kill them. The third night brought no storm, only a silence so profound it felt like a held breath. The moon hung heavy and silver over Heart's Creek, casting long, skeletal shadows across the frost-bitten yard. Inside the barricaded farmhouse, the air was thick with the smell of gun oil and cold sweat. Callum stood by the narrow slit of the boarded front window, his Winchester resting against his shoulder. Across the room, Elara knelt behind the overturned heavy oak dining table, a double-barreled shotgun resting on the scarred wood. Neither had spoken for an hour. There was nothing left to say. The ledger and the gold were secured in a saddlebag, ready to be strapped to Callum's fastest horse if they had to run. But they both knew running wasn't the plan. At exactly midnight, the first torch crested the southern ridge. Then another, and another. A line of 20 riders materialized from the darkness, descending upon the ranch like a swarm of locusts. Pharaoh hadn't sent his men to parley. "Get down!" Callum roared, seconds before the night shattered. A hail of lead tore through the wooden siding of the house. Splinters exploded into the room like shrapnel. The deafening roar of gunfire swallowed the world. Callum didn't flinch. He leveled the Winchester through the firing slat and squeezed the trigger. Crack! A rider pitched backward off his horse. He racked the lever, smooth and mechanical, and fired again. Crack! Another shadow fell. "They're flanking the kitchen!" Ilara yelled over the din. She scrambled toward the back of the house just as the rear door groaned under the weight of a heavy boot. The hinges screamed, giving way. Two men spilled into the narrow hallway, their revolvers drawn. Ilara didn't hesitate. She brought the shotgun up and pulled the trigger. The blast in the enclosed space was catastrophic. The lead man was thrown backward through the doorway as if struck by a train. The second man scrambled back into the dark, cursing violently. Ilara ejected the spent shell, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the raw, violent adrenaline pumping through her veins. "Back door is clear!" she screamed, her ears ringing. But Pharaoh's men weren't just trying to breach the walls. Through the cracks in the boards, an unnatural orange glow began to flicker. "Fire!" Callum yelled, coughing as thick, acrid smoke began to curl beneath the floorboards. "They've lit the porch!" The dry cedar siding of the house caught with terrifying speed. The temperature inside the room spiked, the air growing dangerously thin. "We can't hold them here!" Callum grabbed Ilara's arm, hauling her up. "To the back corral, now!" They burst through the ruined kitchen door, firing blindly into the blinding smoke to keep the attackers at bay. They sprinted across the open yard, bullets kicking up the dirt at their heels. They dove behind the low stone wall of the horse corral, just as the roof of the farmhouse collapsed in a spectacular plume of fire and sparks. "Where is he?" Ilara gasped, wiping soot from her eyes, scanning the tree line. "Where is Pharaoh?" "Right behind you, Mrs. Hart." The voice was smooth, cultured, and completely out of place in the slaughterhouse of the ranch yard. Callum spun around, leveling his empty Winchester. Desmond Pharaoh stepped out from the shadows of the barn. He wasn't dressed for a gunfight. He wore a heavy, pristine wool overcoat. But the customized Schofield revolver in his hand was leveled directly at Ilara's chest. 3 of his surviving men flanked him, rifles trained on Callum. Callum dropped his empty rifle. He slowly raised his hand, stepping deliberately in front of Ilara. "You lost, Hart," Pharaoh said, stepping closer, the firelight dancing in his cold, dead eyes. "The house is gone. The land is mine. Now, where did you bury my property?" "Your property is already halfway to the territorial governor," Callum lied smoothly, his voice cutting through the crackling flames. "I gave the ledger to Silas. He rode out 2 hours ago." Pharaoh's smile faltered. For a split second, genuine panic flickered across the tyrant's face. But he quickly regained his composure, a cruel sneer twisting his lips. "A bluff. You wouldn't let that ledger out of your sight. It's out there, at the crossing." Pharaoh gestured with his gun toward the dark eastern ridge. "Walk." With rifles pressed to their backs, Callum and Ilara were forced to march away from the burning wreckage of their home, down the treacherous muddy slope toward Quinn's Crossing. The valley floor was pitch black, the rain from days ago having turned the ground into a soft, unstable bog. "Where is the hole?" Pharaoh demanded, his polished boots sinking into the muck. He grabbed Ilara by the arm, yanking her forward. "Show me, or I put a bullet in his kneecap." "Let her go!" Callum lunged, but a rifle butt slammed into his ribs, dropping him to his knees in the mud. Ilara didn't scream. She looked around the dark valley. She remembered her father's words, spoken years ago when he had built traps for coyotes. "The earth remembers where it's broken, Ellie. Walk where the roots are thick." "It's over there." Ilara pointed toward a patch of dark, barren earth near the dry riverbed, completely devoid of brush. It was the exact spot Callum had warned her about days ago, the unstable ground. Pharaoh's eyes lit up with feverish greed. He shoved Ilara aside and stepped forward, waving his men to follow. "Dig," he ordered. Pharaoh took 3 steps toward the clearing. He didn't take a 4th. A sharp, deafening crack echoed through the valley, louder than a gunshot. It was the sound of ancient, rotted timber giving way. Pharaoh froze. The earth beneath his feet let out a sickening groan. "Boss?" one of his men asked, taking a hesitant step back. Pharaoh looked down. The mud around his boots was liquefying, spiraling downward. The old, forgotten mine shaft, the one Thomas Quinn had covered with a false ceiling of timber and dirt years before to trap predators, had finally rotted through. Pharaoh dropped his gun, throwing his hands out. "Help me!" he shrieked, the polished veneer completely shattering. His men lunged forward, but the ground gave way entirely. With a horrific, rushing roar, a massive sinkhole opened up, plunging 20 feet deep into the black bowels of the earth. Desmond Pharaoh vanished into the dark, his terrified scream abruptly cut short by the crushing weight of tons of collapsing mud and rock. His men scrambled backward, dropping their rifles, staring in absolute horror at the massive crater that had just swallowed their boss whole. Callum slowly stood up, wiping the mud from his mouth. He looked at the surviving gunman. "The ledger is going to the governor," Callum said, his voice echoing in the sudden, eerie silence. "Pharaoh is dead. You have 10 seconds to get off my wife's land before I bury the rest of you with him." The men didn't hesitate. They broke and ran for the ridge, disappearing into the night. Callum stood in the dark, breathing heavily. He turned to Alara. She was staring at the collapsed earth. "The land doesn't tolerate the men who poison it." Her father's words rang true. Callum walked over and pulled her into his arms. Alara buried her face in his smoke-stained coat, her hands gripping him tightly. They stood together in the freezing dark, listening to the silence finally return to Heart's Creek. Dawn broke over Heart's Creek in bruised hues of purple and gold. The storm of violence had passed, leaving a haunting stillness in its wake. The main ranch house was a smoldering blackened shell. Only the stone chimney and the framework of the front porch remained standing. Callum sat on the edge of the porch, his boots resting in the ash. A crude bandage was wrapped tightly around his ribs, and his face was smeared with soot and dried blood. Yet, as he watched a contingent of territorial marshals ride away down the driveway, taking Pharaoh's surviving men and the iron lockbox with them, he felt a weight lift off his chest that had been crushing him for 2 years. May Sutton had arrived an hour after sunrise with the sheriff, having seen the glow of the fire from town. She had brought a wagon full of supplies and a quiet, knowing smile. She was inside the surviving barn now, tending to the horses. The soft crunch of footsteps on gravel made Callum turn his head. Alara walked toward him. She had washed her face at the creek, her chestnut hair hanging loose and damp down her back. She wore a borrowed canvas coat from the barn, but she carried herself with an undeniable, quiet strength. She sat down on the wooden step beside him, their shoulders brushing. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, simply watching the sun burn away the morning mist over the eastern ridge. Callum reached inside his coat. He pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope that had survived the fire inside his leather saddlebag. He rested it on his knees, staring at it for a moment before handing it to her. "What is this?" Alara asked, her voice raspy from the smoke. "The marshal signed off on the transfer this morning," Callum said quietly, keeping his eyes on the horizon. "The deed to Quinn's Crossing is officially severed from Heart's Creek. It's registered in your name alone. The gold was seized, but the state is offering a massive bounty for the ledger. It goes to you. You're a wealthy woman, Alara." Alara traced the edge of the envelope, her heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. "There's something else in there," Callum continued, his voice dropping slightly, losing some of its steady timbre. "The annulment papers, signed and witnessed by the sheriff. You don't have to carry my name anymore. The debt is paid. You're free." Callum finally turned to look at her. His eyes were unguarded, laying bare the profound, aching vulnerability of a man who had finally found something worth keeping, only to force himself to let it go. "You can go to San Francisco," he said softly. "You can build a house on the crossing. You can have the life Pharaoh stole from your family." Alara looked down at the papers in her lap. The crisp, clean legal documents that dissolved their chaotic, blood-soaked marriage of convenience. She looked at her left hand. The rusted iron nut, wrapped in twine, was still firmly on her finger. She stood up. Callum's heart sank, a cold hollow opening up in his chest. He prepared himself to watch her walk away. It was the right thing to do. It was what Rowan had wanted. But Alara didn't walk toward the road. She walked toward the smoldering ruins of the house. She stopped at the edge of the fire pit where a few embers still glowed bright orange in the morning air. Without a word, she dropped the annulment papers into the coals. Callum stood up, wincing as his bruised ribs protested. "Alara, what are you doing? The paper caught fire instantly, curling into black ash. Elara turned around, the morning sun catching the fierce, brilliant amber in her eyes. "I told you," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I don't run." She walked back to him, closing the distance between them until she was looking up directly into his eyes. "My father died for that land, and I fought for it," Elara said softly, reaching out to rest her hand against the rough fabric of his coat, right over his heart. "But a piece of paper doesn't make a home, Callum. The man who stood between me and a bullet does. The man who would give up everything he has to make sure I am safe does." Callum stared at her, the breath catching in his throat. He reached up, his large, scarred hand gently covering hers where it rested against his chest. "You don't owe me your life, Elara," he whispered. "I'm not paying a debt," she whispered back, a soft, genuine smile finally breaking across her face. "I'm making a choice." She stepped away from him and walked over to the edge of the yard. She stopped in front of the old cedar fence post, the one Callum had stood beside the morning he decided to buy her hand. The carved letters RH 1871 were still visible in the weathered wood. Elara pulled Callum's hunting knife from the sheath on his belt. She pressed the blade against the wood right below Rowan's initials. Callum walked up behind her, watching in silence as she pressed her weight into the blade. She carved an EQ into the wood. Beside it, she carved a CH. Then she paused. She didn't carve a year. Instead, she carved 3 small, deep dots in a row after their initials. An ellipsis, a story that wasn't finished but was finally ready to begin. She handed the knife back to him. Callum looked at the post. Then he looked at his wife. The transaction was dead. The survivor's pact was over. What remained was real, forged in fire, and anchored in the earth. He didn't pull her into a desperate embrace. He didn't need to. He slid the knife back into its sheath, reached out and gently took her left hand. His thumb brushed over the rusted iron ring. "We have a lot of rebuilding to do," Callum said softly, looking out over the sprawling, beautiful, and unbroken expanse of their land. Elara intertwined her fingers with his, leaning her head against his shoulder. "We have time," she replied. The smoke from the ashes faded into the clear blue sky, and for the first time in his life, Callum Hart wasn't afraid of what the earth remembered. He was only looking forward to what it would grow. A year on the frontier could change the entire shape of a life. The biting, frozen mud of the previous November was a distant memory. Now, Hart's Creek was bathed in the warm, golden light of late autumn. The air smelled of sweetgrass, dried sage, and the sharp, clean scent of freshly cut pine. Where the smoldering, blackened skeleton of the old farmhouse had once stood, a new structure had risen from the ashes. It was wider, sturdier, built with heavy timber hauled from the northern ridges. The porch wrapped around 3 sides of the house, offering an unobstructed view of the sprawling valley below, including the peaceful, sunlit expanse of Quinn's Crossing, where a small herd of healthy cattle grazed along the creek bank. Callum Hart stood in the dark, cool earth beneath the new porch, a heavy iron pry bar in his gloved hands. He was expanding the old root cellar, clearing out the last of the deep foundation stones from the original house that had collapsed during the fire. He drove the pry bar into the dirt, leveraging it under a massive, stubborn slab of granite. He grunted, his broad shoulders bunching as the stone finally gave way with a heavy scrape, rolling backward into the dust. Callum wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his forearm, leaning against the wooden support beam to catch his breath. As the dust settled in the dim light of the cellar, something caught his eye. In the hollowed-out earth where the granite slab had rested for decades, there was an unnatural glint of dull metal. It wasn't a buried horseshoe or a discarded nail. It was deliberate. Frowning, Callum knelt in the dirt and reached into the hole. His fingers brushed against something wrapped tightly in heavy waxed canvas, caked in dry soil. He pulled it free. It was small, roughly the size of a brick, but surprisingly heavy. He carried it up the wooden stairs and out into the bright afternoon sunlight, setting it on the edge of the new porch. With his hunting knife, Callum carefully sliced through the stiff, dirt-crusted twine binding the canvas. As he peeled the thick fabric back, a small, battered tin box was revealed. The latch was rusted shut, not from a century in the earth, but just long enough to tell him it had survived the winter and the fire deep underground. Callum wedged the tip of his knife under the latch and popped it open. The lid creaked back. Callum stared at the contents, his brow furrowing in utter confusion. It wasn't Pharaoh's gold. The government had taken all of that a year ago. And it wasn't Rowan's dangerous ledgers. Inside the tin box was a modest stack of worn greenback dollars and a small canvas pouch filled with silver coins. Beneath the money lay a single piece of paper, folded neatly into a square. Callum set the knife down. He wiped his hands on his denim trousers and gently picked up the paper, unfolding it. The handwriting was meticulous, elegant, and entirely familiar. October 12th, 1875. Callum's breath caught in his throat. That was 3 full weeks before he had walked into the sheriff's office in Duskwell. 3 weeks before Desmond Pharaoh had cornered a supposedly helpless 18-year-old girl with a contract of indentured servitude. He continued to read. The money in this box is the last of the Quinn family savings. $84.20. It is not enough to buy back the crossing, and it is not enough to run from Pharaoh. So, I am burying it where it belongs, in the foundation of Hart's Creek. Rowan Hart is dead, and the brother who returned to take his place works like a man trying to atone for a sin he didn't commit. He is stubborn, silent, and he refuses to sell. He is the only man in this valley who isn't afraid of Desmond Pharaoh. I am going into town tomorrow. Pharaoh's men have been following me. When the trap springs, I will make sure Callum Hart is there to see it. If he is the man I think he is, he won't let Pharaoh take me. And if he does save me, I will use this money to buy the seed and timber to keep his ranch alive through the winter. I am tying my anchor to his ship before the storm hits. Callum stared at the faded ink. He read the words again, and then a third time, as the sheer, staggering magnitude of the revelation washed over him. He slowly lowered the paper, a low, rumbling laugh building in his chest until it broke free into the quiet afternoon air. He had spent the first month of their marriage believing he had heroically sacrificed himself to save a desperate orphan. Then he had believed Ilara had manipulated him merely as a shield to get close to her father's stolen gold. But this was something else entirely. She hadn't just manipulated the situation to survive. She had audited him. She had watched him from afar, assessed his character, and deliberately chosen him. She had secretly buried her entire life savings in the foundation of his home before he even knew her name. She had committed her life to Hart's Creek and to him, long before he had ever slid that rusted iron nut onto her finger. Callum looked out across the yard. Ilara was by the northern corral, brushing out the coat of the gray mare she rode every morning. The afternoon sun caught the rich chestnut tones in her hair. She was laughing at something the horse had done, her face completely free of the haunted, hardened edges she had worn a year ago. Callum picked up the small tin box and walked down the porch steps. His boots crunched softly on the gravel as he crossed the yard. Ilara turned as she heard his approach. She smiled, resting her hand on the mare's neck. "Did you finish clearing the cellar?" Callum stopped a few feet away. He didn't say a word. He simply held out the open tin box. Ilara looked down. Her eyes widened slightly as she recognized the rusted metal and the folded piece of paper resting on top of the silver coins. A slow, deep blush crept up her neck, staining her cheeks. She looked up at him, her amber eyes suddenly wide and slightly defensive, like a child caught stealing apples. "Where did you find that?" she asked, her voice uncharacteristically small. "Under the granite slab of the old kitchen," Callum replied, his voice a low, warm drawl. He took a step closer, his eyes dancing with profound amusement and an overwhelming, chest-tightening love. "October 12th, Mrs. Hart. 3 weeks before we met?" Ilara crossed her arms over her chest, lifting her chin in that familiar, stubborn way that had driven him crazy a year ago. But the corners of her mouth were twitching. I was making an investment, she stated plainly, refusing to look away. A girl has to secure her future. An investment, Callum repeated, fighting a massive grin. So, let me get this straight. You didn't just accidentally get cornered by Pharaoh while I happened to be standing outside the sheriff's window. Pharaoh was predictable, Elara shrugged, feigning nonchalance. I just adjusted his schedule a little. Callum shook his head in sheer disbelief. And when I threw my last bag of silver on that desk and offered to marry you to absorb your debt, you weren't shocked? Elara finally let the smile break across her face. It was radiant and unapologetic. She stepped away from the horse, closing the distance between them. She reached out, her hands resting flat against the solid warmth of his chest. I was terrified, she admitted softly, the humor fading into something deeply sincere. Not of Pharaoh, of you. I bet my entire life and my family's last $80 that you were a good man, Callum Hart. I bet that you wouldn't let a girl be sold to a monster if you could stop it. Callum reached up, his large hands cupping her face. His thumbs gently brushed across her cheekbones. You rigged the deck, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. I prefer to call it stacking the odds, Elara whispered back. She looked down at her left hand, which was resting against his shirt. The heavy, ugly, rusted iron nut was still there on her ring finger. Over the past year, Callum had offered to buy her a real ring, gold, silver, a diamond from San Francisco with the bounty money they had received. Elara had refused every time. She claimed the iron suited her better. Now, looking at the tin box, Callum finally understood why. The iron ring wasn't a symbol of a desperate transaction. It was the trophy of a gamble she had played with her life and won. You're a menace, Elara Hart, Callum said, lowering his head until his forehead rested against hers. I know, she smiled, her breath warming his lips. But I'm your menace. Callum kissed her. It wasn't the desperate, adrenaline-fueled kiss of survivors in the ash. It was slow, deep, and anchored in the absolute certainty of a life built to last. When he finally pulled back, he looked over her shoulder, past the corral, toward the old cedar fence post marking the boundary of the yard. The letters R.H. 1871 were still there. Beneath them, their own initials, E.Q., C.H., and the 3 small dots she had carved into the wood a year ago. Callum tossed the tin box lightly in his hand. The coins rattled inside. So, Callum said, a wicked glint in his eye, since you technically bought your way onto this ranch before I bought your debt, does that mean I owe you back wages for the last 12 months? Elara laughed, a bright, beautiful sound that echoed across the valley. She turned, looping her arm through his as they began to walk back toward the newly built house. We can negotiate the terms inside, Mr. Hart, she said. I don't know, Callum mused, pulling her closer to his side. The last time I negotiated a contract with you, it nearly got us both killed. Yes, Elara agreed softly, leaning her head against his shoulder as they stepped onto the new wooden porch. But look at what we survived. The heavy wooden door closed behind them, shutting out the cool autumn breeze. Outside, the land lay quiet and content under the vast frontier sky. The earth remembered the blood that had been spilled and the secrets it had been forced to keep. But more than that, it remembered the people who had refused to let it break them. The ellipsis was finally complete. The story of Hart's Creek was no longer written in the past, but in the long, unwritten years stretching out before them. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, share it with someone who loves meaningful stories, and subscribe to follow more journeys like this. This work is a creation of the author's imagination, designed to entertain and provoke thought. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely accidental. The author assumes no responsibility for interpretations that connect fictional elements to real-world entities.
As the dust finally settles over Hart's Creek, what remains is not just the memory of gunfire, betrayal, or buried gold, but the quiet, enduring truth about what truly holds a life together. This story is not really about a ranch, or a feud, or even the fortune hidden beneath the soil. It is about choices, the kind of choices that define a person when there is no easy path left. Callum chose to stand his ground when running would have saved him. Alara chose to stay when leaving would have been safer. And in those choices, something rare was forged, something stronger than fear, stronger than greed, and far more valuable than anything locked inside that iron box. What we witness here is the transformation of two people who began as strangers bound by necessity, and became something far deeper through shared hardship. Their bond was not built on promises or comfort, but on trust tested, under fire. And that is perhaps the first lesson this story leaves behind. Real connection is not found in easy moments, but in the trials that demand everything from us. When two people choose to stand side by side in the face of danger, when they refuse to abandon each other, even when the odds are overwhelming, that is where something unbreakable begins. There is also a quiet but powerful truth about justice, woven through this tale. The world they lived in was one where the law could be twisted, bought, and silenced. And yet, justice still found its way, not through institutions, but through courage, persistence, and sacrifice. It reminds us that doing what is right does not always guarantee safety, and it rarely comes without cost. But even in a broken system, the actions of individuals still matter. Sometimes, the only justice that exists is the one we are brave enough to create ourselves. And then, there is the land, Heart's Creek itself. In many ways, it is more than just a setting. It is a witness. It holds memory, pain, and truth. It punishes greed, but rewards those who respect it. The land in this story reflects life itself. It remembers what we try to bury, and it eventually reveals what we try to hide. The past cannot be outrun. It can only be faced, understood, and, if we are strong enough, redeemed. Callum carried the weight of his brother's sins like a burden he never chose. Alara carried the loss of her family like a wound that never healed. But together, they did something extraordinary. They did not let the past define their future. They rebuilt, not just a home, but a sense of meaning. Perhaps the most profound lesson of all lies in the idea of sacrifice and intention. At first glance, it seems like Callum saved Alara. But as the truth unfolds, we see something far more complex. Alara chose him. She believed in his character before he even understood his own role in the story. She placed her future in his hands, not blindly, but with a quiet, calculated faith. And in doing so, she gave him something he had lost long ago: purpose. This reminds us that sometimes the people who come into our lives are not accidents. They see something in us we may not yet see in ourselves, and through them, we are given a chance to become who we were meant to be. The story also speaks deeply about resilience. Life will test us in ways we cannot predict. It will strip away comfort, certainty, and sometimes even hope. But resilience is not about never falling. It is about rising again, with something stronger inside us. Callum and Alara did not win because they were stronger than their enemy in the traditional sense. They won because they refused to break. They adapted, endured, and faced the truth, no matter how dangerous it was. And finally, there is love. But not the kind often told in simple stories. This is a love born from fire, from conflict, from survival. It is not perfect, not easy, and certainly not immediate. But it is real, It is built on mutual respect, on shared struggle, and on the willingness to fight, not just for each other, but with each other, until understanding is found. It teaches us that love is not always gentle. Sometimes it is fierce. Sometimes it is quiet. But when it is true, it endures. So as we leave Heart's Creek behind, we are left with